Hello, welcome to A Christmas Carol, a reading by yours truly as a holiday treat for young and old. I and Althea welcome you and hope you enjoy this holiday chestnut. A Christmas Carol, in prose, being a ghost story of Christmas by Charles Dickens. Preface. I have endeavored in this ghostly little book to raise the ghost of an idea, which hopefully shall not put my readers out of humor with themselves, with each other, with the season, or with me. May it haunt their houses pleasantly. Your faithful friend and servant, C.D., December 1843. To begin with, Marley was dead. There is no doubt whatever about that. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I am going to relate. Oh, but Scrooge was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, secretive and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head and on his eyebrows and his wiry chin. He iced his office in the dog days and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. And so, to begin. Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather. The door of Scrooge's counting house was open, that he might keep his eye on his clerk, who in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, Fred, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation he had of his approach. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug! Christmas a humbug, Uncle? You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do. Merry Christmas. What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "Well, come then, Uncle. What reason have you to be so dismal? You're rich enough." "If I could work my will, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of volley through his heart." "Uncle," pleaded the nephew, "I am sure I have always thought of Christmas time as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely and to think of people below them. And therefore, Uncle, I say, God bless Christmas." The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded. Becoming immediately sensible of the impropriety, he poked his fire and extinguished the last frail spark forever. "Let me hear another sound from you, Bob Cratchit, and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation." "Don't be angry, Uncle. Come, dine with my wife and me tomorrow. I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why can we not be friends?" "Good afternoon." "I am sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute, but I'll keep my Christmas humor to the last. So a Merry Christmas, Uncle." "Good afternoon." "And a Happy New Year." "Good afternoon." His nephew left the room without an angry word. He stopped at the outer door to bestow the greetings of the season on the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned them cordially. "There's another fellow," muttered Scrooge, who overheard him. "My clerk, Bob Cratchit, with 15 shillings a week and a wife and a family, talking about a Merry Christmas." This lunatic, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let 2 other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with books and papers in their hands. "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe," said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. "Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" "Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years. He died 7 years ago this very night." "At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts, sir." "Are there no prisons?" "Plenty of prisons." "And the union workhouses, are they still in operation?" "They are. Still, I wish I could say they were not." "I'm very glad to hear it. What shall I put you down for?" "Nothing," Scrooge replied. "Ah," smiled the gentleman, "you wish to be anonymous?" "I wish to be left alone. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there." "Well, many can't go there, and many would rather die." "If they would rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Good afternoon, gentlemen. By the book." At length the hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool and tacitly admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat. "You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose?" "If quite convenient, sir," said Cratchit. "It's not convenient, and it's not fair. If I was to stop a half-a-crown for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound." The clerk smiled meekly, saying, "It is Christmas Day." "And yet you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work?" The clerk observed that it was only once a year. "A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. Be here all the earlier next morning." The clerk promised that he would. Scrooge walked out with a growl, and the office was closed in a twinkling. Scrooge went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms, and the yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, had to grope with his hands, because the fog and frost hung about the black old gateway of the house as in mournful meditation. Now, it is a fact that there was nothing particular about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. And then let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face. It had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. Its livid color made it horrible. But as Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. He did pause with a moment's irresolution before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it first, as if he half expected to be terrified with the sight of Marley's pigtail sticking out into the hall. But there was nothing on the back of the door, so he said, "Pew, pew," and closed it with a bang, the bang resounding through the house like thunder. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes, but he fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs in thick blackness, for darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was right. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in, double locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus, secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown, slippers, and nightcap, then sat down before the fire to eat his gruel. His glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell that hung in the room. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound. But soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. The bells ceased as quickly as they had begun. They were succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person was dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound. Then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below. Then the noise came up the stairs, then came straight towards his door. They won't believe it. His color changed, though, when, without a pause, it came on through the heavy door and passed into the room before his eyes. Why, that's Marley. But he's... Scrooge did not complete the thought. But there was no doubt the same face, the very same Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights, and boots. The chain he dragged clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail. It was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. "How now?" said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Marge." Marley's voice, but bizarre too. "Who are he?" "Ask me who I was." "Well, who were ye then?" "In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can ye sit down?" "I can." "You don't believe in me?" "I don't." "Why do you doubt your senses?" "Well, because you may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are." At this the spirit raised a frightful cry and shook its chain with such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to keep from falling in a swoon. But to save himself he fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face. "Mercy, dreadful apparition, why do ye trouble me? A man of the worldly mind, do you believe in me or not?" "I do, I must." Again the spectre raised a cry and shook its chain and wrung its shadowy hands. You are fettered," said Scrooge, trembling. "Tell me why." "I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link and yard by yard. I forged it of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. You wear a strong coil yourself. It was as full and heavy and long as mine 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored on it since. It is a ponderous chain." Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me." "I have none to give." "But you were always a good man of business." "Business," cried the ghost, wringing its hands again. Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate. A chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer. You are always a good friend to me. I thank you. You will be hunted by 3 ghosts. I think I'd rather not. Without their visits, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow, when the bell tolls 1. Couldn't I take them all at once and have it over, Jacob? Hinted Scrooge. He found his supernatural visitor confronting him in an erect attitude and silent as the grave, its chain wound over and over its arm. The apparition walked backward from him, and at every step the window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached it, the window was wide open. Scrooge became sensible of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge, and floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Scrooge followed to the window, desperate in his curiosity, and looked out. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste, and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. The misery with them all was clearly that they had sought to interfere for good in human matters and had lost the power to do so forever. Scrooge closed the window and tried to say humbug, but stopped at the first syllable, and being from the emotion he had undergone, went straight to bed and fell asleep upon the instant. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of bed he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of his chamber. He was endeavoring to pierce the darkness with his ferret eyes when the chimes of a neighboring church struck the 4 quarters. "The hour itself!" cried Scrooge triumphantly, "and nothing else." But he spoke before the hour bell sounded, and just then light flashed up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed flew open. Scrooge, starting up into a half-recumbent attitude, found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor that had drawn his curtains aside. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man. "Are you the spirit whose coming was told to me?" "I am." "Well, who and what are you?" "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" inquired Scrooge, observant of its dwarfish nature. "No, your past." The apparition put out its strong hand and clasped him gently by the arm. "Rise and walk with me." As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood upon an open country road with fields on either side. The city had entirely vanished. "Good heavens!" sniffled Scrooge. "I grew up in this place. I was a boy here." The spirit gazed upon him mildly. "Your lip is trembling, and what's that upon your cheek?" Scrooge muttered with an unusual catching in his voice that it was a pimple, and begged the ghost to lead him where he would. Suddenly, Scrooge's school at Christmas saw boys in high spirits heading home for the holidays. "These visions are but shadows of the things that have been," said the ghost. "They have no consciousness of us. The school is not quite deserted, A solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left there still. Scrooge said he knew it, and he sobbed. They went, the ghost and Scrooge, across the hall. A lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire. Scrooge sat down and wept to see his poor forgotten self as he used to be. The ghost smiled thoughtfully, waved its hand, and said as it did so, "Let us see another Christmas." He was not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. Scrooge looked at the ghost and with a mournful shaking of his head glanced anxiously towards the door. It opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in and putting her arms about his neck and often kissing him, addressed him as her "Dear, dear brother, I have come to bring you home, dear brother," said the child, clapping her tiny hands and laughing. "Father is so much kinder than he used to be. We're to be together all the Christmas long and have the merriest time in the whole world." She clapped her hands and laughed. Then she began to drag him in her childish eagerness towards the door, where he accompanied her. "Always a delicate creature, whom a breath might have withered," said the ghost. "But she had a large heart." "So she had, thou'll not deny it, my sweet sister Fan." "She died a woman, I believe, and had, as I think, children." "One child." "Your nephew?"
"Yes."
Scrooge seemed uneasy in his mind. Although they had but that moment left the school behind them, they were now in the busy thoroughfares of a city where shadowy passengers passed and repassed. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it.
"Knew it? I was apprenticed here."
They went in. At sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig sitting behind a high desk, Scrooge cried in great excitement,
"Why, it's old Fezziwig! Bless his heart, it's Fezziwig alive again!"
Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, and laughed all over himself. "Yo-ho there, Ebenezer!"
"Dick!"
Scrooge's former self, now a grown man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice.
"Dick Wilkins, to be sure," said Scrooge to the giant. "Very, very much attached to me was Dick."
"Yo-ho, my boys! No more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebenezer!" cried old Fezziwig, skipping down the high desk with wonderful agility. "Clear away, my lads, and let's have lots of room here. Hilly-ho, Dick! Hilly-ho, Ebenezer!" It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off. Fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright a ballroom as you would desire to see upon a winter's night. All sorts of people entered the warehouse in laughter and enjoyment. There were dances and cake and negus, a great feast of cold roast and mince pies, and plenty of beer. Old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig. And when old Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig had gone through all the dances, they cut so deftly they came upon their feet without a stagger. When the clock struck 11, the domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually, as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. The cheerful voices wished their hosts the same with laughing thanks, and then died away. "A small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude."
"Small?"
"He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is that so much that he deserves this praise?"
"It isn't that spirit. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune."
He felt the spirit's glance and stopped. My time grows short." This was not addressed to Scrooge, and again Scrooge saw himself. He was older, his face had begun to wear the signs of care and avarice, and there was an eager, greedy, restless motion in his eye. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in a mourning dress, in whose eyes there were tears, which sparkled in the light that shone out of the ghost of Christmas past. It matters little," Belle said softly. "To you, very little. Another idol has displaced me." "What idol has displaced you?" the younger Scrooge rejoined. "A golden one." "There is nothing on which the world is so hard as poverty, and there is nothing it professes to condemn with severity as the pursuit of wealth." "You fear the world too much," Belle answered gently. "I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one until the master passion, gain, engrosses you." "Well, even if I have grown so much wiser, what then? I am not changed towards you." Belle shook her head. "Well, am I?" "Our contract is an old one, made when we were both poor. I have thought of it, and can release you." "Have I ever sought release?" "In words, no, never." "Well, in what then?" "In a changed nature, in an altered spirit, in everything that made my love of any worth or value in your sight. If you were free today, can even I believe that you would choose a penniless girl? So I release you with a full heart for the love of him you once were." Scrooge was about to speak, but with her head turned from him, she resumed. You may have pain in this, a very, very brief time, and you will dismiss the recollection of it gladly as an unprofitable dream, from which it happened well that you awoke. May you be happy in the life you have chosen, Ebenezer." She left him, and they parted. "Spirit, show me no more. Remove me from this place. I can bear it no longer." He was conscious of being exhausted and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness, and further, of being in his own bedroom. He had barely time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. Awaking in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore, and sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge was ready for a good broad field of strange appearances, and that nothing between a baby and a rhinoceros would have astonished him very much. When the clock proclaimed the hour, a blaze of ruddy light streamed upon his bed, which was alarming, and made him apprehensive that he might be a case of spontaneous combustion. He began to think that the source and secret of this ghostly light might be in the adjoining room. He got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called him by his name. "Scrooge!" and bade him enter. Scrooge obeyed. It was his own room, but it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were hung with a living green of bright, gleaming, glistening berries. The crisp green leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light as if little mirrors had been scattered here and there. A mighty blaze roared up the chimney. Upon the floor, to form a kind of throne, were turkeys, geese, game, poultry, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense truffle cakes, and seething bowls of punch. In easy state upon this couch there sat a jolly giant, who bore a glowing torch like Plenty's horn. He held it up, high up, to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping round the door. "Come in," exclaimed the ghost. "Come in and know me better, man." Scrooge entered timidly and hung his head. I am the ghost of Christmas present. Look upon me." Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed in one simple green robe or mantle bordered with white fur. On its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath, set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free as its genial face and its sparkling eye. "You have never seen the likes of me before," exclaimed the spirit.
"Never," answered Scrooge submissively. "The Spirit, conduct me where you will. If you have anything to teach me, let me profit by it."
"Touch my robe." Scrooge did as he was told and held it fast. That led him straight to his clerk's modest home, where Mrs. Cratchit was laying the cloth for the family's Christmas feast.
"Whatever has got your precious father, then?" said Mrs. Cratchit to her helping children. "And your brother, Tiny Tim?"
Just then in came Bob the father with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he wore a little crutch and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. Two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the kitchen that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper.
"And how did little Tiny Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit.
"Oh, as good as gold," said Bob.
"And better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see."
Bob's voice was tremulous when he told her this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool before the fire. After the Christmas feast was all done, the cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Bob served the fragrant and delicious punch with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily. Then Bob proposed,
"A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us,"
which all the family re-echoed.
"God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim, the last of all.
He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he dreaded that he might be taken from him.
"Spirit,"
said Scrooge with an interest he had never felt before,
"tell me if Tiny Tim will live."
"I see a vacant seat in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die."
No, kind spirit. Say he will be spared.
"If he be like to die, he had better do it, and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief. He bent before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling cast his eyes upon the ground. But he raised them speedily on hearing his own name.
"To Mr. Scrooge," said Bob, raising a glass of punch, "the founder of our feast." "The founder of our feast, indeed!" cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it."
"My dear," said Bob, "the children, Christmas Day."
"Oh, it should be Christmas Day, I am sure, on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. Oh, you know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow."
"My dear," was Bob's mild answer, "Christmas Day."
"I'll drink his health for your sake and the Day's," said Mrs. Cratchit, "not for his. Long life to him, Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year. Oh, he'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt."
Again the ghost sped on, and it was a great surprise to Scrooge to recognize his own nephew, and to find himself in a bright, gleaming room among a house full of cheerful people.
"He said that Christmas was a humbug," cried Scrooge's nephew Fred, addressing his guests. "He believed it too. He's a comical old fellow, but I have nothing to say against him. It would be unkind not to drink his health, so here is a glass of mulled wine ready to our hand at the moment. And I say to Uncle Scrooge—" "To Scrooge," cried every guest. "And a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, wherever he is. He wouldn't take it from me, but may he have it nonetheless. Uncle Scrooge."
The whole scene passed off in the breath of the last words spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels.
"Forgive me if I'm not justified in what I ask," said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe, "but I see something strange protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw?"
"It might be a claw for all the flesh there is upon it. Look here." From the foldings of its robe, the spirit revealed two children, a boy and a girl, yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate too in their humility. Where graceful youth should have filled their features, devils lurked and glared out menacing. No degradation, no perversion of humanity has monsters half so deplorable and dreadful. "They are man's children," said the spirit, looking down upon them. "This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware these babes, for on their brows I see written doom, unless the writing be erased."
"But have they no refuge or resource?" asked Scrooge.
"Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?" said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. The bell struck. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost and saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist upon the ground towards him. The phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. When it came near him, Scrooge bent down upon his knee, for in the very air through which this spirit moved, it seemed to scatter gloom and mystery.
"Damn, am I in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come?"
The spirit answered not, but pointed onward with his hand.
"Ye are about to show me shadows of the things that have not happened, but will happen in the time before us. Is that so, spirit?"
The upper portion of the garment was contracted for an instant in its folds, as if the spirit had inclined its head. That was the only answer he received.
"Ghost of the future, I fear you more than any spectre I have seen. But as I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to live to be another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear you company, and do it with a thankful heart. Will you not speak to me?"
It gave him no reply. The hand was pointed straight before them.
"Then lead on," said Scrooge. "The night is waning fast, and it is precious time to me, I know. Lead on, spirit."
The phantom moved away as it had come towards him. Scrooge followed in the shadow of its dress, which bore him up and carried him along. They scarcely seemed to enter the city, for the city rather seemed to spring up about them and encompass them of its own act. The spirit stopped beside a pair of businessmen. Observing that the hand was pointed to them, Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk. "No," said a great fat man with a monstrous chin. "I don't know much about it either way. I only know he's dead."
"Well, when did he die?"
inquired a tall, skinny, pinched man. "Last night, I believe."
"Why, what was the matter with him? I thought he'd never die."
"God knows."
"Well, what have he done with his money?"
"I haven't heard. They left it to company, perhaps. He hasn't left it to me, that's all I know."
"Oh, it's likely to be a very cheap funeral. I don't know of anybody who would go to it. Suppose we make up a party and volunteer."
"I don't mind going if a lunch is provided, but I insist on being fed." They both laughed more snidely than mirthfully. Scrooge and the Phantom left the busy scene and went where the byways were foul and narrow. Like so many cesspools, they disgorged their offences of smell and dirt and life upon the whole quarter that reeked with crime, with filth, with misery. Far in this den of infamous resort, there was a pawn-shop, where old rags, bottles, bones, and greasy offal were bought. Sitting in among the wares he dealt in was a grey-haired rascal nearly 70 years of age. A woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop.
"Well, Mrs. Dover, what have you got for me?"
asked Joe the rascal.
Bed curtains,
returned the old crony, laughing.
"You don't mean to say, Mrs. Dover, you took 'em down, rings and all, with him a lying there?" Yes, I do," replied the woman. "Well, why not? Look out, Joe! Don't drop that candle wax upon the blankets now." "His blankets? Well, whose else's do you think? He isn't likely to take cold without him, I dare say. And you may look through that shirt till your eyes ache, but you won't find a hole in it. It's the best he had, and they'd have wasted it if it hadn't been for me." "Well, Mrs. Dover, what do you call wasting of it?" "Well, putting it on him to be buried in, to be sure," replied the woman with a laugh. "Somebody was fool enough to do it, but I took it off again. Calico's good enough for such a purpose. He can't look uglier than he did in the shiny one." "Oh, Mrs. Dover, you were born to make your fortune,"
laughed old Joe, who produced a flannel bag with money in it. Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror, detestation, and disgust, which could hardly have been greater though they had been obscene demons buying and selling the corpse itself. The ghost conducted Scrooge through several streets familiar to his feet, and as they went along, Scrooge looked here and there to find himself, but nowhere was he to be seen. Suddenly they entered poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling he had visited before, and found the mother and the children seated round the fire. Quiet, very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner. The mother was engaged in sewing. She laid her work upon the table and put her hand up to her face. "The colour hurts my eyes," said Cratchit's wife. "They're better now. It makes them weak by candlelight, and I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home for the world. I think he's walked a little slower than he used to. I've known him to walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder, very fast indeed. He was very light to carry. It was no trouble. No trouble at all. Ah, there's your father at the door." She hurried out to meet him, and Bob Cratchit in his flimsy comforter came in. "You went today, then, Robert?" "Yes, my dear," returned Bob. "I had promised him that I would walk there on a Sunday. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often." "Oh, my little Tim, my little boy." Bob broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. Mrs. Cratchit kissed him, and his children climbed upon him and kissed him. Spirit of Tiny Tim, thy childish essence was from God.
"Spectre," said Scrooge, "something informs me that our parting moment is at hand."
The ghost of Christmas yet to come conveyed him to a churchyard. Here then the spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. Scrooge advanced towards it, trembling.
"Before I draw nearer to that stone to which you point, answer me one question. Are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they the shadows of things that may be?"
Still the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood. Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge.
"No, spirit, no, hear me, spirit. I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I must have been but for this intercourse. Why show me this if I am past all hope?"
For the first time the hand appeared to shake.
"Good spirit,"
he pursued, falling before it down to the ground,
"assure me I may yet change these shadows that you have shown me by an altered life. I will honour Christmas in my heart, and keep it all the year. The spirits of all three shall live within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me I may sponge away the writing on this stone."
In his agony he caught the spectral hand. It sought to free itself, but Scrooge was strong in his entreaty, and detained it. Holding up his hands in a last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost. Yes, and the bedpost was Scrooge's own. The bed was his own, the room was his own, best and happiest of all, the time before him was his own to make amends in. Scrooge scrambled out of bed.
"Do, Jacob Marley, heaven and the Christmas time be praised!"
He was so flustered and so glowing with good intentions that his face was wet with tears.
"Time alive! The shadows of the things that would have been may be dispelled. They will be. I know they will be."
His hands were so busy with his garments all this time, turning them inside out, putting them on upside down, tearing them, mislaying them, making them parties, to every kind of extravagance.
"I don't know what to do,"
cried Scrooge, laughing and crying, making a perfect Laocoon of himself with his stockings.
"A Merry Christmas to everybody, and a Happy New Year to all the world. I don't know what day of the month it is. I don't know anything. I'm quite a baby. Never mind, I'd rather be a baby."
He was checked in his transports by the churches ringing out the lustiest peals he had ever heard. Running to the window, he opened it and put out his head. No fog, no mist, clear, bright, jovial, stirring, cold piping for the blood to dance to. Golden sunlight, heavenly sky, sweet fresh air, merry bells. Oh, glorious, glorious.
"What today?"
cried Scrooge, calling down to a boy in Sunday clothes.
"I,"
returned the boy.
"Well, what's today, my fine fellow?"
"Today? Why, Christmas Day."
"It's Christmas Day. I haven't missed it. The spirits have done it all in one night. They can do anything they like, of course they can."
Back to the boy, he cried,
"Hello, my fine fellow." "Hello." Do you know the poulterers in the next street but one at the corner? I should hope I did. Ah, an intelligent boy, a remarkable boy. Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there? The big one? What? The one as big as mine? Ah, what a delightful boy. It's a pleasure to talk to him. Yes, my buck. It's hanging there now. Well, then go and buy it. What? I am in earnest. Go and buy it and tell him to bring it here, that I may give them the direction where to take it. Come back with the man, I'll give you £5.
The boy was off like a shot.
I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's, whispered Scrooge, rubbing his hands and splitting with a laugh. He shan't know who sends it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim.
As he stood there waiting for the turkey's arrival, the knocker caught his eye.
Oh, I shall love it as long as I live, cried Scrooge, patting it with his hand. There's the turkey! Why, it's impossible to carry that to Campden Town. You must have a cab.
The chuckle with which he said this, and the chuckle with which he paid for the turkey, and the chuckle with which he paid for the cab, and the chuckle with which he recompensed the boy, were only to be exceeded by the chuckle with which he sat down breathless in his chair again, and chuckled till he cried. Scrooge dressed himself all in his best, and at last got out into the streets. He looked so irresistibly pleasant that 3 or 4 good-humoured fellows said, "Good morning, sir. A Merry Christmas to you." And Scrooge said often afterwards that of all the blithe sounds he had ever heard, those were the blithest in his ears. He had not gone far, when coming on towards him he beheld the portly gentleman who had walked into his counting-house the day before and asked for a donation for the less fortunate.
My dear sir, said Scrooge, quickening his pace and taking the old gentleman by both his hands. How do ye do? A Merry Christmas to you, sir.
Mr. Scrooge, asked the gentleman in some confusion, remembering what he had received at the last visit, and it wasn't a donation.
Yes, that is my name, and I fear it may not be pleasant to you. Allow me to ask your pardon, and will you have the goodness...
Here Scrooge whispered in his ear an enormous amount of money.
Lord bless me,
cried the gentleman, as if his breath were taken away.
I don't know what to say to such munificence. Don't say anything. Come to my office tomorrow. I am much obliged to you, and thank ye 50 times. Bless you, Merry Christmas.
Scrooge went to church and walked about the streets. In the afternoon he turned his steps towards his nephew's house. He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock, but he made a dash and did it.
Fred,
called Scrooge. His niece by marriage had answered the door, and dear heart alive, how she started, soon joined by her new husband.
Why, bless my soul, cried Fred. I'll come to dinner if your invitation still stands. Will you let me in, Fred?
Let him in? It is a mercy Fred didn't shake his arm off. Scrooge felt at home in 5 minutes. Nothing could be heartier. His niece looked and felt just the same. Wonderful guests, wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful happiness. But Scrooge was early at the office next morning. If he could only be there first and catch Bob Cratchit coming late. That was the thing he had his heart set upon. And he did it, yes, he did. When the clerk arrived, he was a full 18 minutes and a half behind his time.
"Hello,"
growled Scrooge in his accustomed voice, as near as he could pretend.
"What do you mean by coming here at this time of day?" I'm very sorry, sir, pleaded Bob, appearing from the tank, but it's only once a year, sir, and shall not be repeated. I am not going to stand this sort of thing any longer, and therefore,
Scrooge continued, leaping from his stool and giving Bob such a dig in the waistcoat that he staggered back into the tank again,
and therefore, I am about to raise your salary.
Bob trembled and got a little nearer to the ruler. He had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with it, holding him, and calling to the people in the court for help and a straitjacket.
"A Merry Christmas, Bob,"
said Scrooge with an earnestness that could not be mistaken, as he clapped him on the back.
"A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavour to assist your struggling family, and we will discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop. Make up the fires and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit."
Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh, and little heeded them. His own heart laughed, and that was quite good enough for him. Scrooge had no further intercourse with spirits. It was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that be truly said of all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone. The end. On behalf of Althea and myself, Merry Christmas, and have a blessed, loving, Happy New Year.